Okay, I'm going to have a seat, and we're going to start talking to the panelists. And I'm going to actually ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll start talking. So why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I'm Charlie Arntzen. Kathy, my wife here, and I moved to Arizona back in 2000. Am I supposed to go through for a few minutes and give the background
about 5 minutes.
my part of this? We got here in 2000, and a lot of the stuff in the news at that time had to do with education. Arizona was falling behind in K through 12, et cetera, was what was in the paper. And the result was an initiative on the ballot in November of 2000 called Proposition 301. The voters in Arizona passed it generously, and what it did was raise the sales tax with the revenue coming into educational initiatives. Most of that money went to teachers, K through 12 teachers' salaries, the infrastructure of the schools, but a portion was carved out for the three major universities in the state, NAU, University of Arizona, and ASU. Now, so that was November. Starting in December, Vice President Jonathan Fink, and I wrote it down so I'd remember, put together what he called a planning group for new economic initiatives in the biosciences. He knew that there was going to be a fight for resources whenever new money arrives at the academia. This will probably surprise the current director of research down here, but back in those days, when there was new money, the faculty would jump up and start fighting for that money. So Jonathan tried to get ahead of it, put together this planning group. I was fortunate to get on the planning group. Actually, I was not very timid. I got up and encouraged them to include me. But we were trying to focus on how we could invest these new millions of dollars of money coming into ASU. At that point in time, in the early 2000s, ASU was really a traditional university, departmental structured. Most new initiatives started from the department level, percolated their way up to the provost and president. But here was and in fact, most of the requests for money were coming out of the departments at the time, and all of them had very good reasons. But I went off to the side, and at the encouraging of the provost, Milt Glick, proposed that we do something separate, start a new institute, not embedded in the departments, affiliated with the university with cross appointments in faculty, but multidisciplinary and tied with industry and outcome-related research effort that could be the new flagship for ASU.
Okay. Before you go further, we want to get to the other two for introductions.
Okay.
We'll come back to that part of the story. So
all right.
This is the beginning of the whole idea. Just remind them what your background was before you got here.
Okay. I came here from Cornell. I'd been the president of a private research institute up there. Came down here, got an endowed chair. My research had been in vaccine manufacturing design. We had also done work on Ebola and other things. So I was interested in healthcare on the basis of basic biotechnology.
All right, we're going to go to...
So I'm Kathleen Matt. I was the initial associate director for the Biodesign Institute. I was a faculty member at ASU and had just done a congressional fellowship, came back to the university and was doing biomedical research. My background is as a neuroendocrinologist. And so it was interesting that I wound up in a faculty position at a university in the largest metropolitan area in the country, Phoenix, that did not have a medical school at that time. And so it was like, how do you do biomedical research in an institution that doesn't have a medical school there? And so it was this idea. So in addition to being the associate director for the Biodesign Institute, I also was the associate vice president for clinical partnerships and biomedical initiatives. And so what that allowed me to then do is work with a lot of the clinical groups and biomedical groups in the community and bring them into, as well as bring the design and research back out to the clinical group. So biodesign played a very important role at that time to really help and make those bridges and those linkages.
All right, and we'll get...
So as my gray hair reflects, I've had a number of positions that span academia, industry, and government. So starting in the 1960s, as many of you know, genetic engineering was only just beginning to start, and I found myself in that domain, which is now commonplace, but at that time you could ask for a large salary and go elsewhere. There were so few of us. And so I was recruited to industry, to GlaxoSmithKline, the large pharmaceutical company, where I eventually became the president of research and development, where we managed to delightfully create 37 new drugs and vaccines during that period. But I was commuting the Atlantic literally weekly at that point. And so in 2000, I decided that's it. Enough of this. We'd always loved Arizona for many years, and so we had built a house out here, and then it was premature because that was 2001 and 9/11 occurred, and I was on the Defense Science Board, which advises the President and the Secretary of Defense on issues, and then I got a call from Secretary Rumsfeld that after, you remember, anthrax followed shortly after 9/11, so I ran the Bioterrorism Task Force for the United States for 2 years, came back in 2003, and then some guy called Crow called me up. And those of you who know Michael know him well. There are very few things you can resist. There was a brief vignette. Michael called me up and said, I'd like to sort of, I understand you're here. And I said, no, I'm now in my 3S triangle, Scottsdale, San Diego, and San Francisco. I was the chairman of a couple of biotech companies in both those areas. I wasn't going to get on a plane any longer other than for short distances. So I had lunch with Michael, and then he outlined his strategy, not just for biodesign, but for the university at large, which I think, as we can all see, has undergone a remarkable transformation in 2 decades. And so as a result of that, Michael said, would you come and kick off the building biodesign? And then I expected to be shown a nice shiny building, and instead it was a dirt patch. And so then with Kathy and Charlie and others, a lot of too many people to mention, we built the first stages of biodesign from 2003 to 2006. But it was rather like Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. If you build it, people will come.
That's right.
And so I think that has been the narrative. So it's, for me, a 2-decade journey, and it's been a great pleasure to see the evolution of this institute.
All right, so let's pick up the story. This idea of an institute, a little bit separate, that had, multidisciplinary themes to it. How did you...
Well, it was in 2001, Jonathan Fink appointed Kathy and I to be director and associate director and try to put this together. And what I don't think either one of us realized at first, but what it really was a job selling the concept of a separate institute to an academic community, and especially in Kathy's case, the surrounding private sector community, on this idea of a research island in a place that was supposed to do teaching.
So I'm sure they loved it immediately and adopted it almost instantly, right?
If Stuart is still in here, he can talk about from the department's level. It wasn't enthusiastically accepted, right?
Really?
But anyway, that part of it was, we spent time going on. But the other thing we were charged with was come up with a building that would house this. I'll give you one little example. So the facility, ASU Facilities Management, put a couple guys together, and they took me around. Where do we have space that you could get into? One of them was an old TB hospital, which is on the other side of the river, dusty hallways. And what really sold me was they had a crematorium in the basement, and sort of was an indication they were thinking our idea was pretty dead already. But anyway, we went through some discussions. Went back to Milt Glick and the provost and Jonathan Fink, and especially Laticour. And at their time in the evolution of ASU, they were revolutionary in that they were willing to accept some new ideas, and they said, we're going to go out and build a new building. Now, another thing about ASU at that time, no buildings were built unless they started with a plan for teaching for a specific department, and the money had to be allocated from someplace, so the money was up front.
Yeah.
Selling the idea that we could do debt service through indirect costs on grants was a novel idea, but finally it was accepted, and it allowed us to break this barrier and start building a building even though we didn't have all the money. The groundbreaking was in January of 2003. It got from just a general idea in 2001 to breaking ground in 2003 because Michael Crow arrived in July 2002, I think it was. And once Michael got there, as George knows well, we're going to do it now, we're going to do it in real time. There's not a lot of procrastinating. And so we went from just a general idea to breaking ground in January of 2003. Fortunately, George I thought he was getting a little bored with some of these other things he was doing, and he wanted a challenge. Anyway, Crow was successful in convincing him to come in and be our first really a director that built the academic component of the university, and we had a great run, George.
Thank you.
And it's really fun to look at these pictures of what the architectural design was like on the top thing up there to what it is today. One other little bit of, I have to go out and applaud the director of facilities services. He was the one when it was finally decided we're going to build a building. He said, and I'd been looking at places on the East Campus and all over. He said, we're going to go to the corner of Rural and Tyler Road. There's some area in there and that's underutilized. Well, that was a small statement. It was Quonset huts that had been left over from World War II and some storage buildings. And he was smart enough to say this would be a good spot. And I mean, it's a highlight of the campus now. It's a major point when you're coming in. So it's been a good run, and Kathleen Matt was key part of getting this thing going and selling the whole idea.
Oh, that's very.
So tell us about that. Where did you have to sell it?
Well, I think, as Charlie said, and again, George alluded to this too, I mean, it didn't exist, and so it was more or less, if we build it, they will come. But I think the other thing that sometimes people don't appreciate, maybe, if you're outside of academics, how much academics is driven by disciplines. And so, but when you think about innovation actually happens at the edges of the disciplines, and it's really in bringing the disciplines together. So interdisciplinary was really important, and translation is really important. And that doesn't happen every day within the academic structure. So I think, on the early days, one of the things that we did before we had a building, before we were recruiting new faculty, which you'll probably hear about later from George, what we did was we had an advisory board, and we brought some of the stellar scholars that were already here at ASU. So one of them, Colleen Brophy, was a cardiac surgeon. And I remember when I met her, she was a cardiac surgeon at the VA. She wanted a joint appointment at ASU, so we were figuring out. She went on to develop her own company, which I think she sold. But we had to figure out how to give her a joint appointment and where that fit and what department it fit. So you began to sort of feel like, what are those constraints around it? And the first time I met her, one of the things that she said was, I want to put myself out of work as a cardiac surgeon, because I want to detect things much earlier so that people are not going to need that surgery. And that's going to take chemistry and biochemistry and physiology and engineering and all of that together. And so we would introduce those kinds of examples. There was Michael Dorman, who was from the speech program doing cochlear implants. A lot of interesting biomedical work was happening across the university, but it was in little pockets. And creating and its initial phases was AZ Bio. Then it became the Biodesign Institute. And it was really an opportunity to bring all these minds together to really generate and create collisions, create collaboration, and create that innovation. So it was a totally, totally new design.
So tell us a little bit about how the vision changed. So George, when you came, things really took a turn, and how did that change, and what was the vision there?
I think conceptually it didn't change in the sense that clearly there was a large capital investment, a lot of people to be recruited, but I think as Charlie and Kathy have already mentioned, I think it was this concept of interdisciplinary fusion, and I think that still persists to this day. So under the broad umbrella, it's biology, medicine, engineering, and computing, and clearly in contemporary terms with the onslaught of AI that amplifies computing further. But I think that with not only the solid foundation they created and then all of the work that I and many other talented people were able to do, including establishing a new advisory board, which I'm delighted Carolyn was a member of, and obviously subsequently going on to get the Nobel Prize. But I think the key issue was this sort of not only the intellectual shift, but it was a cultural shift in terms of, I used to have to check under my car each night on leaving because clearly there were a lot of opposition to this structure. But I think eventually we pushed it through, and clearly Michael was a major catalyst in that as well. But it's like everything else, it's a coalition of the willing. And there were enough faculty who were prescient enough to see that this was going to be the vision of the future. I think Charlie has an interesting anecdote he should touch on in terms of having to be rescued from while the building was under construction. But just another brief vignette was the fact that when Building A was finished, with Michael Crow having been the chairman of In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm, which he still is, and I had just come from the Pentagon, there was a rather scurrilous publication called The New Times that then, so if you want to think that conspiracy theory is new, it's not. I'm glad to let you know that black helicopters were seen to come and go from Building A at night.
Right. Yeah, so do you want to tell us a little bit about...
Well, one of the things that when George was trying to recruit faculty, brought in Roy Kurz, member of the National Academy of Sciences, and I was escorting him through, showing him the new facilities. Building A, which was one of those pictures, and there was our first building going up. And we went up the elevator to the top floor, which was had a door that opened out to the roof. We went out on the roof, and we're looking around, seeing where the campus was expanding, and heard the door click. And
how old was Roy at this point?
Oh, God, Roy had to be 70 years old.
Yeah, okay.
And here we are. It's pretty hot up on the top of the roof. So we had to get out of there. And this was 2002, 2003, somewhere in, you were there, so it was 2003. We didn't have iPhones then. There's no way to call anybody. So I found my way across these girders to the far end of the building. It's probably 75 yards to find a workman's stairwell to get back down to the bottom and then go back around and rescue Roy. But we did a lot of work for you, and dangerous work.
In that incident, even without iPhones, someone called me and said, "We've just seen Dr. Arntzen go down the outside of the building."
It was a collaborative effort, George, as always.
So tell us a little about recruitment, because that a key to building the institute. I'm the beneficiary of your hard work and bringing in such great people. So how did that work?
I was obviously delighted to recruit you and many other people, but I think we both, Kathy and I, have cited the term, if you build it, they will come. And I think the two, by definition, having a total state-of-the-art facility so that you could actually show people this was tangible. I think that this sort of issue we've touched on several times tonight of technological convergence and the need to translate, to sort of use President Crow's terms, use-inspired design. I think that appealed to a certain category. It totally turned off certain academics, certainly within ASU and at large, but there were others who saw this as really a totally new way of doing things, as my colleagues have just emphasized. So I think that, we were very judicious in who we sought to interview. If we'd known more about you, we wouldn't have interviewed you, but that's a different, different issue. But, but Josh, I was fortunate in recruiting Josh and many other people, but it was, again, having a great advisory board. And as that period, 2003 to 2006, evolved, the transition in the university at large was beginning to take place. The traditional departmental structure had begun to be dissolved, more and more centers and institutes. So I think it was a duality. We had both the momentum within biodesign, but people, if they wanted to make independent assessments of what was going on, could find out that this was a transition in the university at large.
Just a thought, we're talking about multidisciplinary and changing the culture. And George, as a former member of the Monsanto board, you'd appreciate, when we had our architect come in, first in 2001, the new architect designing the building, he was trying to get the features we wanted. And one of the things I did was took him to Monsanto, because at the time it was probably Biotech Central, and showed him how you just have a big open laboratory. People aren't assigned to a bench and they don't just stay there all the time. Central research facilities with staff manning the equipment that keep everything going. Clusters of offices where people interact. And he did a brilliant job of building A first, and then your other buildings as they came along.
And I think, just reflecting on that further, it was also not only an open plan, but many of the units were on wheels, essentially gliders, so you could move them and reconfigure them as you wanted. So, and I think that, as certain groups expanded, then we just moved new units in. I think that the only other thing in terms of the culture of the times was the fact that horror upon horrors, we installed retinal scanners, right, which almost introduced a revolution amongst some of the more myopic academic faculty who couldn't understand why this was happening. But once again, it means that this is really the Department of Defense running this facility. What they didn't stop to think was the fact that because of Charlie and Roy Arntzen, Charlie and Roy Curtis, we actually had a biological safety 3-level facility for handling the most dangerous pathogens. And under law, you actually had to have a clear record of who came and went. And you may want to tell the story about the Mayo visit.
Yeah, so I had talked earlier about the partnerships, and one of the very specific and strong partnerships we had was with Mayo Clinic. And so as that partnership continued to develop, we set up a visit from Mayo Rochester to come to Arizona. And so in Building A, the auditorium, we had a big event there. And one of the features, as George was describing, of the Biodesign Institute in that first building, and I'm sure in the others, is that when you go through the doors, it is an open laboratory, so that you can have that flexibility and move around. And so for that, then, they did put these retinal scanners in the front, and everybody had to be cleared, because once you went into that entryway and into the laboratory space, you were in an open laboratory space. So there had to be clearance to do that. So of course, Michael Crow is in the auditorium, and he's doing the presentation to Mayo with all of the higher-ups from Mayo Rochester. And I get the word that we are going to go through the building and get a tour of the building and meet a bus on the other side. So I went and told the people at the front desk in Biodesign, and they said they can't go through unless we check their ID cards. So I went and told Jim O'Brien what the response was, and he said, "This is the president of the university. He will be leading them through." So they opened the doors, and we led them through.
But you had to be at president level to get through there.
Right, exactly.
But of course, everyone who was unescorted who did go through without a security clearance is now on the counterterrorism watch list. But that's a different issue.
But all these things we're talking about, it was a radical departure from academia as it had existed before, and there was a learning curve as we went through all this. Sometimes a bumpy curve, but.
And clearly reflecting what's been, I remember an extremely gifted individual who recruited, I won't name because I don't want to embarrass them, even though it's a very positive issue, very talented assistant professor who was otherwise going to be poached elsewhere, and to move someone from an assistant professor to full professor was no precedent for that whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I went to see Michael, boom, done.
Yeah.
Right.
So Newtonian physics has this property for particles called momentum. And that is, you have to actually put energy into those particles to make them change course or move. And academia sort of has a little bit of that property as well, right? So getting departments to actually change their ways and move. So tell us about some of the momentum you faced in the departments and what strategies you had to use to get folks to look at a new direction.
Well, I think, among other things, but one of the hardest was recruiting new faculty that the selection of the new faculty didn't arise out of a departmental meeting,
Right.
but arose by some crazy guy directing the Biodesign Institute who came to your department and said, I found somebody really good. I'd like to recruit Carolyn away from Stanford and et cetera. Well, they would want to see academic credentials. We went through this with Motorola. One of the first presentations I made off campus in 2001 was to Motorola because they had a biosciences division. It was diagnostics, essentially. And we wanted to do partnership with them. Well, it turned out not too long after I talked, and it wasn't my fault, but they abandoned their bioscience initiative. But we were able to recruit a team coming out of Motorola. And that, again, was a challenge because they didn't have an academic credentials, published papers, et cetera. So to try to get those people into the university. But it got done. Those things had to happen, and I think hopefully they're more commonplace.
At this point, it's considered a plus to get a biodesign faculty, so it's been a lot easier.
Yeah.
In the early days, I know there was resistance, but it has changed.
Yeah.